Standard Chartered has received another fine this week, $300 million from its old friend Ben Lawsky at the New York Department for Financial Services. Follows on from a $340 million fine a couple of years ago. I'm here with Martin Arnold, our banking editor, to talk about that. There's a bit of an elephant in the room here, or at least a bald eagle, isn't there, Martin? Because Americans tend to think their regulators are dispassionately enforcing financial probity around the world, and non-Americans tend to feel that this is economic warfare. What do you think's going on?
Well, if you look at the response to this settlement that Standard Chartered has agreed, where the settlement included partial bans on Standard Chartered's ability to clear US dollar transactions in a couple of countries or regions, Hong Kong and the United Arab Emirates, two of their biggest markets. And the Hong Kong regulator and the UAE Central Bank have both reacted since the settlement was agreed. The Hong Kong Monetary Authority came out with a very defensive sounding statement saying that they are on top of money laundering issues and that they've looked at Standard Chartered very closely and they don't see any serious issues that require. So they were very prickly.
And it's going a lot further than that, isn't it? Because I think that France is going to bring this whole issue of US fines up with the G20 following a whacking fine for BNP earlier this year.
That's right. BNP Paribas was hit with a $9 billion fine earlier this year, and the French it caused a bit of a diplomatic kerfuffle.
Are they right, do you think? Are US regulators bashing the foreigners?
I think that there is a certain extent where you can see how the French would view it as the Americans trying to use monetary power rather than military power to impose their foreign policy objectives. So, for instance, BNP was hit for violating sanctions on Sudan, Iran and Cuba. But when you read the statement of facts, these are pretty flagrant violations and were going on for many, many years, and the French bank made huge amounts of money from doing this business, which was illegal and clearly illegal at the time.
Of course, and how does the US regulators treat their own banks? You've got an example today, I think.
Yes, and $9 billion sounds an awful lot for BNP Paribas, but the foreign banks aren't the only ones that are getting hit by US regulators. Today we expect a $16 to $17 billion settlement to be agreed by Bank of America in the US with the Department of Justice for mis-selling mortgage securities during in the build-up to the financial crisis.
If the US is a world policeman when it comes to foreign policy, insurrections, terrorism and so forth, at least it speaks with a clear voice via the president. When it comes to banking regulation, it isn't very clear at all what's going on because you have a series of different regulators, some of them local, all of which seem to be competing for fines and for influence. What would you say to that?
Well, there are many US financial regulators. That's a fact. And this is a criticism that is levelled at the US financial regulators, that there is an inflation of penalties being imposed and they seem to be competing. But I would say that you're not going to hear me defending some of these banks who've been caught out for misbehaving. I mean, Standard Chartered have been fined $300 million. That's 2 years after they were fined more than $650 million for not monitoring properly and complying with anti-money laundering. Now, they promised to clean up their act. 2 years later, they've been found wanting by the monitor installed as part of that original settlement, and their systems were not picking up millions of transactions that were potentially suspicious and involved potentially suspicious clients. They weren't being flagged up. Yeah. So these could have been illegal, it could have been terrorism financing.
I hear what you say. We can't defend criminality or wrongdoing, but at the same time, if you are pro-US regulation, I don't think you can close down the wider debate about extraterritoriality by simply saying anybody that we fine is in the wrong camp. There has to be questions over the size of fines, reach, and the degree of interference in how banks run their business. So thanks very much, Martin, for talking the issues through.